Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hi, and welcome to the next episode of Decoding AQ. I have with me an all-star, a Hall of Famer. I have John Baldoni, so welcome.
Well, thank you, Ross. I don't know that I've been referred to as a Hall of Famer, but I will accept it. Thank you.
Well, John, as a globally recognized leadership educator, certified as a corporate executive coach, but also a host of a live LinkedIn show, author of many, many things, 800 leadership columns, 15 books that have been translated into 10 languages. I mean, that's not only an accomplishment, that must be exhausting, John. I'm getting in the final stages of my second book, and I feel, a real effort in that. So well done.
Well, thank you very much. I didn't do it all at once. I've been around the block a few times, Ross.
It's true. Someone shared with me, this piece about creativity and books, works of art. Is they're never finished, they're just abandoned. At some point we reach a realization that, okay, this is now half ready, so I need to get it out there. And getting into that rhythm, of course, we accumulate capability and confidence as we move forward. Right. So where I want to start, John, with you, because you've been, as I understand, a number of decades making your own way, making your own value and impact for others. And in doing so, you've come across, I imagine, some amazing stories, some amazing leaders, some failures in each of those pieces. But what was the very maybe embryo that got you started in this path of leadership? What was the embryo that started that for you?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm glad you are focusing on that, Ross, because leadership as we know it is something of a fad. Not that leadership is a fad, it's something of. So I'm not trying to play word games. When I was growing up, high school, university, Jesuit educated, very proud of that. I don't know that I ever heard the word leader other than in reference to a head of state. And I certainly don't recall ever hearing the word leadership. I witnessed leadership daily from those who taught me, those who set the right example, my own parents, all of those things. I was shown what leadership is. Leadership, as we discuss it now, really most closely resembles what is originally developed in our military. And so I'm not saying that our leadership is militaristic, but leadership, certainly in the United States, was developed very strongly within the military sector. So our organizations were more like the military, hierarchical, but they didn't value the concept that was leadership. It was more command and control. Yes, that is somewhat in the military too, but the military has a rich tradition of enabling those in lower ranks below whoever the commanding officer is to offer their opinion and discuss it. And so you don't do your own thing, but it's a different type of thing. So leadership became a study and something in the late 80s. And so that's when it hit me. I was in marketing communications, and then I became a speechwriter, and I was asked to write speeches about leadership, and I became intrigued by the concept. And as a speechwriter, I said, oh, I would rather be saying those things, which for a speechwriter is crossing the Rubicon, because anonymity is the hallmark of a speechwriter. So I went back to school, got a master's, and started pursuing this and started writing, which was my core attribute. Published my first book. Then I became certified as an executive coach, and I've been writing and teaching ever since. So the work that I do now is something of a second career, say the last 25 years or so. And so doing that, it's giving me a different perspective. And so I have a little different lens upon which to draw. But, I think leadership is here to stay. And as many have said, leadership is the salient differentiator between success and failure. And so, and now it's even more important as we seek to bring out the best in others. And that's really what leadership is all about. And of course, companies did this before they used the term leadership, but it's more in vogue now and more acceptable and much more in demand. And that's what employees want and expect of their leaders.
And I guess it's interesting when we look at the history of phrases or concepts, and a leader versus leadership versus then what environment are we leading in? What's the context? Is it a militarian context? Is it a political context? Is it, and one of the subjects, of your LinkedIn's live session, grace under pressure. So leadership can show up that we're leading ourselves, we're leading others. It's a act of service, as you said, to enable others to be the best versions of themselves. So if it started for you from this writing aspect, writing speeches, getting excited by it, and now going into a form of educating, because of course to educate someone, we have to understand it. That's a great journey, isn't it, to write about these things?
Right.
What would you say in the situations and the environment that we're in at the moment? What are some of the attributes or shifts that leadership has, or what are some of the stable things that leadership has in the current situation we find ourselves?
Well, it's a good question. I always used to say jokingly when asked a question similar to yours that nothing has changed in leadership. And in truth, leadership is time immemorial. But there have been a few factors of change. One is the velocity of change. Two is globalism. And we got a lesson in globalism with, of course, the pandemic. What happened for the world, an obscure part of China, not saying that Wuhan is, but that had it happened 50 years ago, it likely would not have spread because we would not have had global travel. The other major change is women in not only the workforce, but women in leadership and management. So those are the folks. I will tell you personally, for me, and why I explored the topic of grace is because it speaks to me. When I started writing books, almost 25 years ago, I kind of did what I call nuts and bolts leadership. I had the privilege of writing over 200 pieces for Harvard Business Review online. And I call it my nuts and bolts leadership about typical things, dissension in the workplace, communications, you name it, the sort of workaday stuff. I'm very proud of that. But over time, I got to the point, explored new ideas. And so to me, I say my purpose statement is to help women and men learn to live and lead with greater purpose and grace. So my head is in the grace sector. And I think I published a book on grace May of 2019. It was not an immediate success, but boy, has it taken off since. It's because that's what we're looking for. So I define, grace is I'm dealing with it from a secular standpoint. So grace is that catalyst for the greater good. So it's generosity, it's compassion, it's caring, commitment for others. And when you do it as a leader, you do it to bring people together for a common cause. So I'm more than ever in the quote soft stuff of what leadership is, and that's where I'm going to remain in the sunset of my career years. It's what I explore. I'm very intrigued with the idea of looking at the workplace as community and how we foster this sense of belonging. And that's what people want. We want to work for goals greater than ourselves, but we also want to be part of if we're going to be organizational, we want to participate in organizations bigger and bolder than ourselves, and where we feel that we can commit. And that's what community is. And community is not everyone shares this exactly the same mindset, nor should they, but that's a cult. So it's people of different opinions, different points of view, but are bound together by similar values. Now, I say something like purpose. Purpose is our why. We've heard that in many places. Simon Sinek has popularized it. So purpose, what does it do? It sparks our vision, which is our sense of becoming. It creates our sense of, sparks our mission. What is mission? Mission is our doing, okay, and our building. And you know very well, Ross, that you can achieve one's vision and one's mission in spite of people. You can, mow them down. I mean, so often we see organizations like that. However, how much better is it to bring people along with you? That's where grace gets involved. That's the value proposition, because values create our sense of belonging. So to me, purpose and grace are interwoven into a sense of community where people feel that they belong and want to contribute.
And I guess to a certain aspect, we have these friction points where there's a disconnect from that. It might be a disconnect in oneself. Sometimes that manifests in these things like midlife crises, at 40, at various points, whose life are we living? And we might have a disconnect from who we were to who we want to be. And the same is true that we're seeing in organizations of who I was showing up to be, what I was part of, and do I feel part of that community? Do I feel a sense of belonging? Or do I actually feel I want to go in a new direction? And I think the mobility of what are we seeking? What's our ambitions? Are we seeking just to exist, or are we seeking to have, as you say, this common value, this common purpose, this common endeavor that's bigger than ourselves? And these friction points where in our world, it's about adaptation. How do we look at abilities, character, and then in the environment and go through this continual feedback loop to reassess and give yourself permission to make new decisions tomorrow, to make new choices, to have that freedom. And I'm interested because when you talk about this grace under pressure, it's often the pressure shows the best and worst of humanity.
It does.
How would you sort of explain that?
John Wooden, who's a famous basketball coach in the U.S., is now passed on, but he lived to the grand old age of 99, quoted something that is attributed to him, but he borrowed it from others, adversity doesn't create character, it reveals character. And such as with grace under pressure. That's a phrase that Hemingway once used, and maybe in a way popularized by one of our presidents, John F. Kennedy, who incorporated it in his book, Profiles in Courage. So yes, grace under pressure, as I define it, is the ability to remain calm and collected and composed and courageous when the heat is on. When the sun is shining, anybody can be a leader. I mean, it's more of a, making sure things, don't get out of whack. And, it's more management. And I have great respect for management. Don't get me wrong, because leaders who don't manage don't succeed, and managers who don't lead often are not as successful. So the two are intertwined. But grace under that pressure is that ability to keep it together when everything else is falling apart. And I often use the example of a 5-alarm fire, which is there's a lot of heat, there's a lot of noise, there's a scurrying about, and it's really hot, but you will see often the most calm person on site is the fire battalion chief. and they remain composed. They are exhibiting grace under pressure because that's their job. And imagine if they were not acting, if they were saying, oh my gosh, I've never seen a fire this bad, that would terrorize the people who report to them. So they may be feeling that. They don't show it in the moment. And that's what grace under pressure is. And I think we've had a great example, sadly, these last 2 years in the pandemic of many leaders who have stepped forward. And lately in keynotes, I talk about where we've come. Think about where you were 2 years ago in February or March of 2020 and where you are right now. Well, first of all, you stand up and give yourself a big pat on the back because you've survived. In many cases, you have thrived. And I think part of that is because either you have been a leader or you have been well led, and so you've succeeded. And so now we're beginning, or have been creating our quote new normal. So we've learned a lot. And so now the pressure is on us. How do I take grace into this quote new environment, the new workplace, the hybrid workplace, or the virtual workplace, or whatever the workplace is. And, I think we're redefining what how to work is. And, the idea of working from anywhere was well entrenched prior to January 2020. It merely accelerated with COVID. And I would attribute that comment to someone I recently interviewed, Callie Yost, who's a futurist as it regards to work. She's talked about that and talks about that and teaches that. And so, it's an exciting time. And most importantly, I think we have something here in, I think, Europe and here in the US called the Great Resignation. Well, another way of looking at it is actually the Great Liberation, because employees, we're rewriting the social contract, at least for a short period of time, because talent is in demand. So what is it employees are looking for? And while it might drive hiring managers a little bit crazy, and I can sympathize with them, the challenge is that if your employees are thinking of moving, and that's fine, how do you keep them? Well, the first thing you do, it's this magical concept, Ross, that I don't know, it's a secret formula. You know what you do? You have a conversation. So what are you thinking? Where do you want to go? All of those types of things that we kind of forget about because we're, quote, too busy. So all of this stuff we're in an exciting time for business. But what the pandemic has taught us, I think, or challenged us, because for a period of time, we were very isolated from one another. So that created time to think. So people reconsider, is this my career? Or if it's my career, do I want to continue this way, or do I want to do it differently? Again, redefining work. All those are positives, because there will be short-term pain. Obviously, we're going to figure this out. But humans are highly adaptable creatures. And so we'll figure it out. And so that's where, but part of that is I think we're looking more and more, again, for meaning and purpose in our lives and in our work. And for me, that's where grace enters the picture.
Yeah. And it's this beautiful concept that many can appreciate and think about and say, yeah, I admire that. I admire this calm in the storm. I admire the grace under pressure. But some of the realities of how our systems work might not give us the space, the ability to have that distance and disconnect to go into respond mode, and we're in react mode. We have the heightened fear of pressure and uncertainty, that we get this cortisol hit, we get the amygdala hijacking, and actually our behavior and decision making might not be what we're looking for when we are sat back, when we have that court sense. How do you deal with that real reality?
Well, actually, I'm going to push back on this. You've described it absolutely perfectly, Ross. No argument with that. But there's something called resilience. And I've had a couple of folks on my show, one even from the Royal Marines, Gareth Tennant, one of your own, right? A wonderful young man, a strategist, and had talked about resilience. And I've also talked to other special forces people. They train in dynamic, stressful situations so that when they are in a combat situation or a high pressure situation, they know how to react. And that's what this pandemic has done. Leaders have been forced to experience crisis day after day relentlessly. And so we've learned how to adapt. So yes, the normal human reaction is when there's chaos around to the temperature goes up and you think, but there's an old saying in the military and saying that when the heat's on, the commander's voice gets lower because they've taught them, they have been taught and they internalize it and they teach that because they have to keep it together. If they do not, then they're not suitable for the role, but then bad things happen. So you train yourself for it, and that's how you do it. And so expecting a young, well, I shouldn't say this, but in an ordinary workplace, a 22-year-old walking into a chaotic workplace isn't going to respond the way a veteran of 50 will. Part of it's that age and experience, but having been through it before. So that's why it's up to the more veteran managers to teach this. And one of the things we can teach is resilience. And I've always thought of resilience as that ability to bend but not break. There's a different dimension, and I've learned that from a colleague, Eileen McDarg, who talks about bending, you don't break, you come forward, but the world in which you're bouncing forward and the world into which you're bouncing has been transformed. And this is a perfect metaphor for where we are now. The world of 2020, January 2020 is not coming back. Where we are in 2022 is completely different in many ways, but we have learned from it. So we have been transformed by this catalytic event, and we're still here. And so that's the kind of thing we should, again, champion or feel good about what we've accomplished in these past 2 years. And so that's how you adapt to it. It's a matter of acclimation, training, and also, a resilience training, and that's taught a lot as well. But it's the ability to also know one's limitations. And, a colleague of mine, Sharon Melnick, who's was a clinical psychologist, now she's an executive coach, talks a lot about the on-off. A lot of leaders are in demand and they're always on. Well, if you're always on, you're going to burn out. And it's nothing to do with your willpower. It's all to do with your ability, capacity to function. Going on short sleep, stress does not improve your life. It makes it harder for you. So you got to learn to turn off. And that's really hard for people who are outwardly directed, but they have to care for themselves. Again, that's where grace comes in. We need to, as we challenge ourselves to show grace to others, to people in need, and to bring people together, we got to show grace to ourselves. The word we use is self-care. And I know that gets mocked by people, but if you don't take care of yourself, who will? And here's the equation on this, Ross. You cannot be effective as a leader if you don't take care of yourself, if you don't eat right, moderate behaviors, all of those kinds, exercise, all of these things, regenerate. You need to rejuvenate, regenerate, connect with your friends and your family outside of work. You can't do that all the time. I know that, because there are times of deadlines or whatever, but you have to optimize your life balance. Integrate work and life together, because they're especially now, they're not separate. So you need to learn how to manage both components of that.
I guess it's why the oxygen masks go on yourself first, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that you can't help anyone else if you're starved of oxygen. And it's interesting that you brought up resilience, because that's one of our 15 dimensions that we measure in our AQ model. And so we've got thousands of data points, and looking at the correlations between things like resilience or work stress, or between hope and between grit, and all of the nuances of those things, that from our research and our work, the resilience of where in one aspect, it relates to the size and volume of change, to the energy required, and it can be in coping at sort of a base level of resilience. I am coping with that, to I'm transforming because the level of change on externally or internally requires a bounce forward, as you described. Mm-hmm. And I think the challenge comes is when that's perpetual, when there's no off, when we're in this pressure for a period of time, it's so often hard to see until it breaks. And how do we see maybe some of those early signs that we can put things in for grace to help us come out of that?
A quick thing is the harder task will take you longer. I mean, you've probably seen this in your research that, after a while, if you overwork per se, not even burnout, you basically become punch drunk. What takes you 15 minutes may take an hour. So your cognitive processes are worn out. But here's the trick for leaders, because they want to achieve and they want to succeed. One of two could be one of two or both factors. One, they feel invincible or indispensable, flaw number one. Or flaw number two is I can't take time off because people need me. Flaw number two. Okay. So you have to address that. So that's where this concept of turning things off and shutting down. And it's an active process. And the operative point is that you're not shorting other people. You are doing your need for rest, your need for rejuvenation, for recharging. It's not just for yourself. It is for others around you, because you can't optimize. You can't function, as you said, without oxygen. You need oxygen. And if you feel that your people cannot succeed without you, well, your ego might be a little inflated, or you don't have the right people around you because you're not managing or leading them correctly if they can't function for a period of time without you. So those are and that gets into that self-awareness, where knowing myself. And interesting, a colleague of mine, Tasha Urich, wrote a wonderful book called Insights about self-awareness. And so many of us, even well-intentioned people, are not really self-aware. However, we think we are. So that's where coaching and the discipline process of learning, looking at oneself and evaluation, getting feedback becomes so important. And it's an act of courage. Let's be honest, self-care, or, looking at myself so how I can become better, you become vulnerable. But it takes guts to admit that and do that. And it's not that you have been, quote, wrong. Sometimes you've made all of us have made mistakes, and we will make many more because we're human. But it's this idea that we can't continue doing what we're doing. And so we have to make changes. So,
and I think the beautiful opportunity we find ourselves in now is the willingness for a playbook rewrite, to go from where I remember my own psyche and bias was, you took time off when you'd done the good job, right? When you've worked hard, you're so exhausted, then you take your time off, and that was the reward. Whereas I think we've just got that backwards. We should be taking the time off so we can do the good work. And
it's a good point. That's a very good point. Yeah, I hadn't heard it quite that way, but you're absolutely resonates with me, Ross.
Yeah, and that,
so thank you. Yeah.
Rewriting, as you said, is this great liberation of connecting with purpose. It's also the systems and functions that we've got to unlearn from how we worked. So if we've got this opportunity to rewrite it, it's not only why we're doing it, but it's also the opportunity of how. So these things of, I want to feel belonging and not socially isolated, but still work remotely. How might we do that? I want to not be working so hard that I need time off, that actually by day 3 of the holiday, I become ill because everything's shot because it's not used to slowing down. To actually No, that's the stuff you do to enable the good work. All of these sort of shifts and these paradoxes that exist, I think we've got this beautiful opportunity for leaders to show that way, to have that courage, to experiment, to be able, as you've talked before, this concept, of psychological safety, of being able to fail, that for a leader to have the vulnerability to not know the answer is different from perhaps the historical, no, they're the leaders, they're the ones with the answers, they have the clarity, they make the decisions under pressure, to no, they're the ones guiding the experiments, guiding the learning. What's your thoughts in terms of just that shift to not only, we've talked about adversity and resilience, but actually to prioritize the right challenges and the right parts of the playbook? Where might we look for some of those clues, John?
It's a good framing. And I think what's important to think about the shifts is these are things that occur. They're out beyond our control. So what that means is we don't control them per se. We only control how we react to them. And so that's where you need something I call patience, which is very hard for leaders to implement. Why? Because it's perceived as a passive process, when actually it's an active process of controlling how one reacts to stimuli, okay? It's also that ability to shut down, to remain calm, be present, be mindful of what's going on. So I think mindfulness is important. And that sense of mindfulness is the ability to be in the moment, aware of what's going on. From a leadership standpoint, and I wrote about this in my book, Moxie, that there's situation awareness. Again, from a military is, what's happening around you. Okay. So it's not that you're just present, but what's happening around you. And so these are very important attributes too. And that gives us a process for diagnosing what's happening, and then how I react or don't react to it, and where I put my resources. But it's also the acknowledgement that life is bigger than we can control. And so there's a sense of humility about that. We should have it. And so if there's a humility about the great wide world, it's also a humility about leadership, which is I can only accomplish so much. So my role as a leader is to empower others. A great scholar, Admiral Stockwell, who was at the Hoover Institute, but before that, he spent 7 years as a prisoner Vietnam during the Vietnam War in what was called the Hanoi Hilton. He was a pilot who was shot down, and he talked about that. He wrote a book about Stoic philosophy when it came out, and he talked about something about how leaders gain power by giving it away. And that's the essence of successful leadership, is when we call it delegation or empowering, giving people responsibility. But when a leader is seen not to hoard power, but to distribute power, it's a different dynamic. And people want to be involved in that. Why? Because they feel they have a degree of control, on what they contribute, but also into the greater whole. But they also feel most importantly, they feel part of what we talked about before, something greater, because I'm recognized for what I do. I'm not viewed as a worker. I'm viewed as a contributor. And when you mobilize this band of contributors, great things happen. So,
what advice would you give, John, if we've, as a leader, given that away, this power to create power, and we've given freedom and we've given areas, and what comes back we don't recognize? An echo chamber is where what we say, we hear it. It's the same language, it was the same voice, and we go, oh yeah, that sounds familiar. If we're dealing in an area now where somebody we might give that to could come up with a different how, something that we don't recognize the language, we don't recognize their method, their process for it, what advice would you give leaders in how do you deal with that, to maybe empower it? Do you quash it? What do you do when you don't recognize a response back in a way of achieving a goal?
That's a good question. And I like the way you framed it. We should always be looking for ways to reinvent how, not necessarily how to do what. So what do I mean by that? Within an organization, you have your strategic imperatives, you have your vision and your mission. As long as what is done within the mission and in company with the values, then you're fine. How people do things, that's okay. But when people violate the values or get apart from them or start doing things differently in the organization, that's problematic. And here, the classic example of that is operating a business without a strategy. Now, some people will go, well, that's ludicrous. Well, I think most businesses operate without a strategy. So what does that mean? It means they are vulnerable to not maximizing their potential financially or manpower wise, or even serving their customers. Because what do? They are intrigued. They chase the bright, shiny object. They don't worry about margins. And so whatever you do has to be within the strategic imperative of the organization. Otherwise, it's not fitting in. That doesn't mean what the individual is doing is wrong per se. It's not in keeping with what the organization is. We always want people to be able to streamline or improve processes and even tweak policies, all of those things. But we don't want them inventing new lines of business that don't complement the strategic imperative. If they want to start a new line of business, well, bless them, but they need to leave that organization because that's not within your charter. So that would be how I would respond.
An interesting paradox, isn't it, between the avenues of business of how do we utilize and improve, how do we build on the core, extend the value of the core, versus explore and transform, find the brand new, the imagination that doesn't exist. That's the blockbusters Netflix. That's all of these scenarios of where we get these points of disruption, of where you see that way of, is that in charter, out of charter? Is that a new way, an old way of doing things? And I want to just end, if I may, on a couple of bits of this balance between finding brand new and making what you've got better, and the curiosity to empower people to do those maybe in parallel. And I think the best organizations have areas in which those are both playgrounds to enable growth, to enable development, and natural friction in that is positive, is a good thing.
Without question. So I like the way you framed this. So curiosity sparks creativity, and leaders have to be curious, and you want to nurture that. We have it as children, but sometimes it gets beat out of us by another C word called conformity. Okay. So curiosity sparks creativity. And what is creativity? What is innovation but applied creativity? So, and then when it comes to innovation, there's two kinds, or at least in my term. I don't think I'm unique in saying this, but there's little I and big I. Big I are the breakthrough products, that change the dynamic. And we know them from our history and all of those. Little I should be happening every day. That's the process improvement, either to a process, to a product, to changing a policy, to improving a service. All of those things we need to be doing. That's a form of growth in a sense. So finding a balance between the little I and the big I, and you may work in an organization that never has a big innovation, but is very successful because it continues to meet the demands of its customers and delights them and changes and adapts with their needs too. Yeah. And so we see that. So, and the tension is good. And there's the concept of dissent. You always want, welcome dissent over ideas, but not people, because that leads to friction. Friction between personalities is not always healthy in an organization, but debating ideas should be de rigueur, because failure to do so leads to groupthink. And when we groupthink, then we're all thinking the same way. And A, that's boring. And B, you kind of remain in a stasis. You don't grow. So,
and I guess these same things apply beautifully when we reflect on ourselves, between what are we working on for mastery and what are we working on for curiosity. So for a business, for a leader, for a team, for an individual, that is the beauty of life, is to play that dance, to sing to those things. And to finish us up, John, I've got two questions. Then my last question will be, how do people get in touch with you? But my question before that, linking to curiosity, is, when was the last time you did something for the first time? And what was it?
Oh, that's a good question. And I'm going to punt on that, but I'll tell you why. The two interests in my life are golf and piano. Neither do I do well, but I love them. So golf is all about me and my friends. Okay. Piano, going back to it, it's a self-betterment for me, but it's an enjoyment. It's an experiment with another language. It's something I can share with others. You should know, I post a little piece of music every Monday on LinkedIn. I call it Motivation Monday. It's a little piece of music. Sometimes it's an improv. Most often it's something that I have played, and just kind of a little pick me up. It's a pick me up for me. I don't know if it picks anyone else up. So I'm always trying to do things differently. I've had a long history. I mean, I started writing books, then I went to articles and blogs, and now I do infographics, I do videos. So I'm always doing these different kinds of things. So I think that I've always been restlessly creative, and now piano was something I did as a child, but abandoned it. And then also I've gone, doing a little bit of photography again, which I did heavily as a young person. And now I've gone back to it a little bit, taking pictures of my grandkids, but other things too. So, and in my last book, I integrated photography in that. So I think I'm always restlessly creative in that way, Russ. So I can't give you when's the last time I did something new and different. I think it's in a possibility of rediscovering. For me, it's new applications. That's what it is. I'm integrating music into my work. That is new and different for me. So.
It's beautiful. And I get kind of two trains of response to that. One, the sort of literal of, oh, I skydived for the first time, or I did this, or others are, I'm doing the same thing, but with new eyes or in new ways. And that is equally valuable for us in our curiosity to find in this playful opportunity to integrate a passion of music into work, to integrate these different things of a new channel. Used to write, now I video. What are these things? And I think that gives us this balance of knowing we bring something, we contribute, but we're also learning. And I remember, just very quickly, somebody shared with me, our lives should be split into three: a third earning, a third learning, and a third serving. Don't know which order they come in, John, but earn, learn, and serve. And I thought, actually, I quite like that. I quite like that sense of where we are, able to contribute, we're able to learn, we're able to serve, and we're able to earn, whatever earning is, an applause, a sense of reward, a check, whatever that may be. So how do people get in touch with you, John? It's been an absolute real pleasure. I've learned lots of little pieces, and I can't wait to reflect on this one as well. But how do people get in touch with you, John?
Well, the easy way is my website, johnbaldoni.com. There it's kind of a gateway to my books, videos. Also, I do something I alluded to, I didn't tell it. I have the John Baldoni Library, which is a concept I borrowed from my friend and mentor, Marshall Goldsmith. collected my first 200 articles for Harvard Business Review, plus 150 videos on coaching video. I call them coaching videos I did for SmartBrief. And they're in the library, johnbaldoniblog.com, and they're accessible. You'll find my infographics there too. But, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Amazon. So if you can't find me, let me know, because I'm doing something wrong.
We'll place a load of those links in. And I think this movement of knowledge philanthropy is an amazing piece that we can gift, as we are just mere custodians to a moment in time. And how do we leave it better than we found it? By sharing, so that hopefully the people next can go higher and further. And it's been a real pleasure. Thank you, John. I look forward to following more of your work. I have to say, for our regular listeners, the interview and setup with John, because everyone, I do the internet stalking to try and get to understand and know. And with John, it was probably the easiest I've had in 60 interviews, where so well prepped, great little videos, nice little short pieces that I could feel like we were connected before we were connected. So thank you for that. And I look forward to having another conversation soon.
Well, thank you very much, Ross. And you made it so easy because you did your homework and asked such great questions. I appreciate it, and thank you.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit AQai.io to gain your personalized report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQME assessment. AQai, transforming the way people, teams, and organizations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review, and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.